The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the first day of this 7-day session in May, going into June 2023. And I'd like to share with you this afternoon an email actually, that I received from a student recently. I guess nobody sends letters these days, but email is how it's sent, unless you go for text. Lots of very simple ways to communicate. Hi, Roshi. I had a very intense dream last night that featured a wooden statue of Kwan Yin. And I had an understanding that there was no Kwan Yin outside there, but that the essence of that figure was actually a part of myself. Over the past week, I've had a kind of sensation of being enmeshed in time and space and beingless that is different than I usually experience. And sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and consider this. So perhaps something is getting shaken loose. Another thing was that I had a 43-year-old patient today who in the ICU who has AIDS and is refusing to take her medications. And she came in with disseminated fungal infection and almost in a coma. I was treating her, and in a very odd way, a very odd sensation, it felt like facing a black hole. I kept poking into the sensation to see what it was, and then realized she had a lot of self-hatred. But it was the point that I've never expressed. That it was being expressed. It was to the point where it was being expressed externally as well as internally. I had to work on expanding my chi so as not to get latched onto. Interestingly, earlier this morning, I was drawn to wearing my Buddha pendant, so maybe that was helpful. At any rate, let's start with the first one, that she had a vivid dream of realizing that Kwan Yin is not outside of herself. Now, what is Kwan Yin? Kwan Yin was originally conceived of in India as Avalokiteshvara, who was so deeply moved by the pain and suffering in the world that it is said that his head split into many different heads. And that's why if you see a photograph or a figure of Avalokiteshvara, the figure normally has a number of heads, 7, 9, or 13, 11 or 13. All the better to see where there is pain and suffering and do something to relieve it. And that has transformed through China into Kwan Yin, a bodhisattva of compassion, who is often depicted as having 100 arms, each with a different implement that can be used to help relieve suffering. In the Tibetan Buddhist trainings, there is one kind of visualization in which you visualize, and in the Tibetan Buddhism it's called Tara, the same emanation of compassion, coming into your heart and becoming you. This is a very, very important experience. I bring it up because the difficulty most Westerners have in accepting themselves fully, allowing themselves to receive unconditional love and kindness is pretty predominant. Negative self-image is extremely common in the West, and unfortunately, it becomes a great block in Zen practice. There's pain behind it. These self-images don't come out of nowhere. They come as a result of our experiences growing up. And if we've had experiences where we have been taught, either verbally or through behavior, that we're not very good people, or we're not worthy, then we adopt that within ourselves, and it becomes a self-image. And as I said, behind that is the pain of whatever has happened to you. And it can be as simple as a little kid falling off a bike, and the adults around laugh at the kid instead of scooping him up in their arms and helping him realize that he's going to be okay, that people care. There are many other things that can happen to us. Some of them relatively mild, some of them quite intense to the point where they would lead to post-traumatic stress. And all of it is what we don't want to feel. Who wants to feel pain? Who wants to feel that you don't rate, that you don't really belong in this universe? And it's important to open to that and work with it gently in order to be able to proceed in your practice. Because innately, every human being is filled with compassion and wisdom and is worthy of honor. Perhaps we do things that are not particularly honorable, but the beingness that we are is worthy of honor. And that is incredibly important to recognize. It's a hard thing to recognize. We try to push it away because to feel what might be behind it is too painful to want to open up to. Yet, if we're willing to do that, and the person that has written me this email has done a great deal of work on herself. Gradually, we dare to open to where we are fearful of opening. And in the end, I have to say this, that the fear of opening to whatever is stored in our body in the way of energy that reflects the pain and suffering we've experienced is far greater than the experience itself. And I don't mean the past experience that caused the pain and suffering. I'm referring to allowing yourself to open in your body to the energy of that jagged experience or painful experience or frightening experience or whatever it is. And of course, if you've had PTSD, it can help a great deal to work with a trained therapist who is very skilled in working with people with trauma. There are many, many ways to work with trauma. And at a certain point, we are able to use meditation to reach a point where we gradually become free of the residue of this that is stored in our body. If we don't, then the second part of this email is what manifests. Another thing was that I had a 43-year-old patient today in the ICU who has AIDS and is refusing to take her medications. And she came in with a disseminated fungal infection and almost in a coma. I was treating her, and it was a very odd sensation. It felt like falling into a black hole. I kept poking at the sensation to see what it was, and then realized she had a lot of self-hatred. But it was to the point that was being expressed externally as well as internally. And this does happen. Our mind is a very, very powerful and impacts the physical aspect of it, which is not really separate. And so when we have a deep self-disdain or even self-hatred or self-disgust, and I would expect that given the cultural negativity around people who have AIDS, that this woman had a lot of self-hatred, and that it was hard to allow herself to experience it other than as rage directed at herself. And that manifested as refusing to take her medication. In other words, a kind of suicide. Hopefully most people have not gotten to that point, but I did know someone who refused to take her medication and was in great physical pain as a result of that, and would start a sesshin. This is not at Mountain Gate, and go to the opening ceremony. Then the rest of sesshin, she would, no matter what the temperature, curl up in a fetal position in her room, covered head to toe with a heavy blanket. And then at the end of sesshin, she'd come to the final night of sesshin. This person as well has got some self-hatred buried somewhere deep inside. And the result is a profound depression that is driving her life. It's important to become aware of discomfort, particularly mental emotional discomfort, because when we do, we have a chance to tune in to the sensations that create that discomfort and allow them to dissipate. And if we tune in fully enough, in other words, go into that felt sense and stay with it as fully as possible, when we are fully one with the self-felt sense, then it will naturally dissolve. And it may come back, but it will come back quite a bit weaker. And you may experience it, 2 or 3 more times after that, but each time more weak. And then there's a measure of freedom that has opened up to you as a result of being willing to experience that energy to the point where you are so one with it that it dissolves. This is the way to work with these things when they come up in our Zen practice. And they won't necessarily come up in our Zen practice as an obvious thing, a memory or something like that. They will come up as a sense of being blocked, or a sense of disinterest in Zen, or a difficulty getting yourself to your cushion. When I was first starting Zen practice, it was extremely difficult for me to get to a cushion and start sitting, because there was a great deal of pain and anguish buried inside me. And every time I would go to sit, I would usually burst into tears because it was so painful. But eventually, of course, tuning in and with some good therapy, as well as reading that book by Eugene Gendlin, called Focusing, in which he describes the felt sense and how to open to it within yourself. And I discovered that if I wrote down a description of that sense in my body, even if there was no description to be written other than just this blankness, which really meant dissociation. But even just to write that down made a big difference and opened up to something else. And again, if you're going to do this through journaling, it has to be done with pen or pencil on paper. It cannot be done dictated, and it cannot be done on a computer. It does not have the same neurological effect, actually. There's something about using your hand and your pencil or pen to actually write out the words that describe the sensations in your body that allows you to be tuned in to the sensations and present enough to be able to describe them. Otherwise, it can be very difficult. But working with the felt sense is an incredible way to help ease any barriers in your practice. And this is why I brought up these two comments. As I said, everyone is naturally endowed with innate compassion and wisdom. The experiences we undergo as we grow up can cover that up and almost disappear it, except it will never be disappeared. It will only go underground. One way of expressing this is Mitra-roshi has often said that even people who do the most dastardly things, in this case, people who start wars and so on, have love for someone somewhere inside. They have love for their mother, for example, although that's a little dicey because maybe you had a mother that was pretty brutal, and so it's hard to love that mother. But there may be somebody else. There may have been a teacher. There may have been a pet, an animal, a cat or a dog that offered you unconditional love, and somehow it connected to that unconditional love that is buried deep within you. One of the major aspects of our practice is to uncover that through seeing through that self-image. And as we do our practice with curiosity, with wordless curiosity, with an inner search in our body, we gradually will open to that and become more and more free. This is the promise, and it's a real promise of our practice, and it works. It calls for courage. It calls for dedication. It calls for a willingness to walk into the bodily sensations that express the pain and suffering that are caught inside of our body as a result of experiences we've grown up with. And it can be done. It's been done by many people. And to override that, one can go superficially deep in one's practice, enough that one can, to a certain degree, work on koans even. And there have been examples in the past in the United States and elsewhere where the practice was superficially deep, but wasn't truly deep. And as a result, the people that were made teachers who had not worked on their stuff, who had not opened to experience the pain and suffering in themselves that begot pain and suffering for others. And so they continued that cycle of creating pain and suffering. So it's a very, very important aspect of what we call here a 360-degree practice, and what Torei Enji, who is a Dharma successor of the great Zen master Hakuin, called the Long Maturation. Not to sweep anything under the carpet, but to bravely hunker down and feel. You don't have to feel it all at once, believe me. There was a time when I had a certain level of anxiety, and I decided it was time to work on it. And so the image that came to my mind was trying to skate across a half-frozen lake. Now, you know, when the lake is frozen, you can usually, if it's thick enough, you can even walk across. Even when I was living in Canada, people used to drive cars across. But then when it comes to springtime and thaw begins to happen, it's not as strong, and the ice may crack, and it can be a dangerous enough crack. There was a story about there's an island in the St. Mary's River in near Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, where I was living at the time, and you had to reach it by ferry during the summer times, but you just drove your car across in the winter. And it was spring. The ferry landing just before that was a high hill, so you had to come down the hill, and then you would go onto the dock and onto the ferry if the ferry was there. And this was early spring, so the ice was beginning to get thinner, and I don't know whether it was a wagon or a sledge, which is a huge sled used commercially. This one was led or hauled by a team of 4 horses, so it was probably pretty heavy. And it slid down the hill and across the deck and plunged through the ice. So here I was trying to skate across this half-frozen lake, and there was no understanding of why I had to, but I had to. And so I would put my skate out just a few inches, and the ice would crack, and the shiver would go up my middle, and I waited till it settled down, and then I'd put the other shoe out, the other skate out. Same thing, crack, and again this energy would shoot up towards my neck through my chest, and then when it settled down, I would tune into it, and when it settled down, then I would continue with the next foot. And then after about 1.5 years, I one day realized that I was all the way across the lake, and that the anxiety had no more bite anymore. There was just sort of a little fear that was like a companion, and not with any negative sense to it. It just was there, and it was neutral. No pain, no suffering, just neutral. And I was deeper again in my practice as a result of that. So this is how to work with these things. I also know that much earlier in my life, and I'm referring to the AIDS woman with this comment, I would chase fear or terror, is what I finally realized it was, throughout my body. I would get this symptom, and then I would get that symptom, and then I would get a different symptom. And gradually through time, they all just are actually through time and a lot of Zazen and therapy, they all disappeared. So this poor woman, who certainly hated herself to the degree that she was willing to die, It's a sad situation. But it is something to recognize can happen, and that contrary to that, we all are imbued innately with compassion and wisdom. So take that into your practice. Recognize that if you're feeling a block in your practice, disinterest, or feeling like you're stuck, or like you want to run away, all kinds of things can come up for people when they're blocked. A lot of avoidance techniques we have in our pockets, but the only way to become free of whatever it is you're trying to avoid is to walk into the sensations in your body and breathe deep. Stay tuned into the sensations. The physical sensations are just what is caught in your body as a result of the experience. You don't have to remember the experience or experiences. In fact, it's more effective if you just go into your body and don't bother with what might have happened. At some point, you may get insight into what happened, or perhaps you already know. But that's less important as the energy of those experiences that is caught in your body and inhibiting your ability to live fully this wondrous life. Thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.